Thank you. Music divine here. Hey, how you doing, man? Don't forget, let me know. I emailed you. Oh, you did? Hey.
Hi.
Oh, see, that's how people are afraid of you. Listening to their people shit. Now, Kristen, we have a visitor. Ray Lynn brought her father. She got to introduce her. They're not getting away.
This is Larry.
All right. I'm honored to be here. Thank you. Hey, nice.
Artist from California.
You're welcome, man. Parents are welcome anytime.
Great to see you. And John, you have a visitor as well.
Yes, Ryan is my partner from Chicago.
Yes.
Hey. Hi, how are you doing?
Good.
Are you Irish?
No.
He said Ryan.
Uh-huh.
That's an Irish name, right?
I know.
He said no.
I don't know who in my family named me.
So you timed your visit to miss the talk? To miss
Yes, she missed my
Oh, yeah. I would have heard it though. Great, I heard it.
Okay, welcome everyone. So it is an honor and a joy to welcome Faith Smith at today's Fellows Colloquium. She is a long-time and generous friend of the Hutchins Center and among its most illustrious alum fellows. She is Associate Professor of African and African American Studies and English at Brandeis University, and at her home institution, she has been honored for her teaching, revered for her dedicated service, and much admired for her activist and advocacy work across her campus. Her scholarship interrogates the complexity of Caribbeanness, the meaning and contours of Caribbean sovereignty. Creole recitations, John Jacob Thomas and colonial formation in the late 19th century Caribbean, her first book, is a groundbreaking study of the 19th century Trinidadian linguist Thomas and other early figures in their own contexts and in relation to later nationalist movements for which Creole serves as the foundation of an authentic Caribbean literary tradition. Strolling in the Ruins, the Caribbean's non-sovereign modern, is forthcoming from Duke University Press and has already been hailed by scholars in not only Caribbean studies, but also Black studies as a brilliant reconfiguring of Caribbean modernism. Strolling in the Ruins looks to the 19th century for the start of modernism, and then across regions to enlarge the sphere of cultural and intellectual exchange. Her new project, DreadKin, revisits the meaning of the Caribbean by examining visual culture, the texture of Blackness on canvas in the work of artists and fiction of the last decade, to ask, how do the Caribbean's descendants of enslavement and indenture weigh the claims of memory, desire, kinship, and prosperity in our contemporary global moment? Before we welcome Faith Smith, I am told by our tech experts that we should be careful about not speaking without a mic in hand, because this is being recorded and also being broadcast live to a virtual audience. Okay, please welcome Faith Smith.
Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be in this space. I don't take lightly what it has meant to sustain a thriving center for African and African American studies research. And so the center, but also the Research Institute, which convenes us here. It's a great pleasure to work with all of you every day, knowing that you are around and about figuring out these questions as well. Thank you to Justin Michael Sneed for this design, and to Jim and Johnny for their technical support today. And I'm so grateful every day for the quiet support and warmth of Krishna Lewis, Kimberly Lewis, Velma DuPont, Del Hamilton, and Tom Waleshko. I should begin by saying that for the most part today, I'll be referring to the English-speaking Caribbean most of the time, okay? And so what that means is when I say post-abolition, that means the early 1830s and after, Okay, that's what post-abolition means in that context. So this year I get to devote my full attention to a project provisionally titled DreadKin. Sometimes I use the term dread intimacies. I haven't decided yet what I'm going with. Dread has the inflection of fear, apprehension, waiting for the worst to happen. And in at least some corners of the Black diaspora, you will know that the word came to be identified with the persecution by the colonial and then post-colonial state of Rastafari as a locus of unruliness, terror, savagery. And dread is also the response to that persecution, the courting, if you will, of that dread. An oppositional stance being impugned as dread. Dread is an identification of a particular performance of the Black body with incivility and barbarism. Dread also incorporates this negative understanding of Blackness into a critique of the racial imperial project, an affirmation of Black agency and power, and an invitation to be mindful, upful. And here we are reminded that dread talk pried open both Jamaican Creole and Jamaican English, imbuing words with new meanings, for example, or rejecting me as object pronouns in favor of I and I, and also urging speakers to hear and take responsibility for phonological resonances of language. So not understanding, but overstanding, and not oppressing, but downpressing. Slide 1, please. And earlier this week, the online OED featured this. Sorry, not slide 1, the first slide after the title slide. Right, so I was amused to see this as the word of the day, but you can see how downpresser is an invitation to think critically about oppressor, right? The idea being that when you oppress somebody, in fact, you're oppressing them down, and so on. Okay, thank you.
I love that. Apparently, the very end.
Yes, exactly. So dread challenges the norms that consider Black people, poor people, have-nots, cantankerous people, rebels, as what must be persecuted, stamped out, avoided. The term, used often in daily life, captures a range of inflections, from suffering, it dread out there, to prophecy, to salutation. As with the hairstyles that are associated with dread, so with persons and interactions. Dread, as well as dreads, people or hair, elicit respect and admiration, as well as deep loathing, sometimes towards and within the same person. But intimacy and kin also have oppositional inflections residing in each term. Intimacy and intimation, as Lauren Berlant reminds us, concerns the anxieties attached to what is shared and private, the stories we tell in the hope that our relations or lives will, quote, turn out beautifully. And I find very generative also Lisa Lowe's layered definition of intimacy in her discussion of the racialization of labor and migration in the Americas in the 19th century context of Asian indentured labor in the wake of or in anticipation of the abolition of slavery. One of these layers of intimacy for Lowe is intimacy as white bourgeois intimacy, an entitlement to privacy and interiority and domesticity as a refuge from statecraft or the hostile relations of the marketplace. The propertied elite rights-bearing subject deemed to be in rational possession of his will, his interiority, and then to bring this superior will to his relation to others, the conjugal partner gendered female, and those non-white others whose labor undergirded this existence and who are not themselves entitled to privacy or deemed to have interiority. Besides this sense of intimacy as the privacy of the bourgeois home, Lowe defines intimacy in terms of the contiguity, the spatial proximity of adjacent connection of constituencies brought together from all over the globe to work side by side as they are wrenched away from one space and then sutured to other spaces in order to guarantee the best conditions for order and for accumulation. So for her, intimacy is about bodies from different constituencies, different parts of the world, touching each other side by side as they do this work. And then for Lo, there's also another resonance of intimacy in terms of what she calls the volatile contacts and cross-racial alliances of these groups. So I take the difference between those two to mean one is the force coming together, the other are the kinds of relationships and actions that they make together in that context. Another theorization of intimacy for me, which is really resonant, is Christina Sharp's discussion of what she calls monstrous intimacy. So that's the first book. Not only the sexual exploitation of the black woman in the kitchen of elite Southern whites, her role as the one who secures everyone in their place, but for Sharp, what is also monstrous is the narration of this as in her words, a neo-plantation romance of innocence and intimacy, including or especially by her children. For what, after all, are the stories that we can live with? So the narration of kin and lineage is key here. What can we say aloud or in private about our people or lineage? How do we embellish or erase? What circumstances prompt a narrative at all? So here we're already thinking about kin. Hortense Spiller points out in her examination of early 18th century ledgers, one column with Negro and some sold per head, and the other column with not just names, but the precision of first name and surname, so that the named and surnamed are propertied and kinful. And Spillers notes that, quote, the destruction of the African name, of kin, of linguistic and ritual connections is so obvious in the vital stats sheet that we tend to overlook it. So how does a black subject become identified as nameless, kinless, and who is seen as or charged with bequeathing this disinheritance, of extending this peoplelessness into the future, into perpetuity, of reproducing this state of unfreedom? And how does one shake this off in order to produce the self or the collective as entitled to inheritance? How can we understand the impulse to name and traditions of naming, the investment in naming, as part of that process of narration and re-narration? And as I'm thinking about Lo's intimacies of contiguity, this also has implications for kin, about the ways in which colonial commentators, religious and nationalist leaders, post-colonial law, have all positioned and continue to position different racialized groups in opposition to each other. And so to take another post-abolition migrant constituency, but this time contract labor from the Indian subcontinent, as my example, we can think about how colonial officials would compare the outsized matrifocality of the haphazard Negro home to discourses of the properly patriarchal male and docile female reproducing good family life in the Indo-Caribbean home. They'd compare the sarried and bejeweled body of the Indian woman, which was surveilled and discussed in terms of thrift, good taste, and an ancient civilization, as opposed to the raucous colors and accents of the overspending black woman. These remind us that each group is defined, at least in part, by its proximity to the other group. And we should also keep in mind how each apparent compliment or favorable description has negative consequences. The designation of woman as docile or insubordinate is always entangled with violent control, whether inside the home or in public policy. Praise for thrift is never very far away from condemnation for a miserliness that threatens to stagnate the economy. Being designated lazy or industrious, is linked to the state's investment in a continuous supply of labor for the sugar industry. Attentiveness to women's clothing is connected to ideas about family life, reproductive futurity, a group's class aspirations. Anxieties about sexuality and heterosexual coupling, and about femininity and the gendering of wage labor, all of these are entangled with each other. Race bodies get linked to single and unyielding constituencies even as cross-racial intimacies tell a different story. So that's the other thing. Each body that becomes categorized as black or Indian, for example, when in fact many people are both of these, in fact have descendants either way. And so there's then therefore we're talking about the kind of collective practices of naming and so on that get attached to very often the kind of visual presentation of the body. Some bodies get linked to the Caribbean or the Americas more broadly, while others are never linked to the Caribbean in more than a tenuous way, no matter how many generations connect them to the region. They're always seen as transient. Yet African indentured laborers, those who came on contract after abolition, might have been viewed as different in particular ways, yet not in terms of being out of place in the region. In other words, blackness was something that was supposed to be there, right? Even if it was demeaned. This becomes part of a conversation about Creoleness, in which the Creole, the Criollo, whether white or black, that is to say, claiming European and or African descent, this figure is deemed to be unquestionably tied to the region because of being linked to an authenticating plantation matrix. And any group any group entering the region after abolition of a different racial category is seen forevermore to be outside of that constituency. So Lebanese come temporarily after abolition, subcontinental Indians come afterwards, and so on. And so forevermore, there's always a question, does this body belong? Does this body belong? Note that this sometimes even extends to maroon communities, which had a fraught and complex relationship to enslaved plantation life. In some formulations, they're seen as outside of what constitutes this Creole insider matrix. So they have communities, as you know about marronage, runaway communities, sometimes with a very complex, in Jamaica, some of those treaties required that that after the treaty was signed, they would send back runaways after that point to the plantation and so on. But in some theoretical formulations today, the maroon is not really that kind of core Creole identity. Again, because they're outside of that plantation matrix. Sometimes indigeneity is viewed as non-distinguishable from maroon or presumed to be extinct, so therefore also not part of that core identity. So to go back to questions of transience, in this project, I'm interested in the extent to which these assumptions have haunted not just the 20th century, but our present. If wearing a sari in the 19th century is connected by observers to the lineage of an ancient civilization, how does it also cut the person off from the assumption of an ongoing and dynamic relationship to the Caribbean? When Chinese-born men in the Caribbean told their Caribbean-born children that they were inferior to their children back in China, how were place and lineage similarly working together to assign or remove value? How were old and new worlds being negotiated in these equations? The next slide, please. I think that's right, yes. So just two photographs here as a way of, these are all, this is 2011. I'm sorry, 1911. This is something like 1907. And in my notes is a Jamaican postcard, but I need to verify that. This is an Ellis Island. I remember the first time I saw it when I visited Ellis Island. So it's 3 women arriving from Guadeloupe, all right, in Ellis Island. And we can think about how that changes our sense of what Ellis Island is to my mind, generally, the kind of visual representation of arrivals at the Ellis Island border. I guess what I'm gesturing towards here is the way in which, the talk ends with me coming back to visuality, but the way in which different bodies are going to be loaded with meaning when it comes to thinking about dress and so on. In the bottom postcard in particular, we want to think about how colonial officials and other observers would refer to the saris, but particularly the jewelry, and use this to identify these women as indelibly Indian, of India, not of this space in the Americas. When in fact, the jewelry, as commentators have pointed out, this jewelry was often smelted from their, from the coins that they had earned as wage laborers on sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean. So they, in effect, they were wearing their wages. So in fact, it marks them as workers in the modern plantation system, standing side by side with workers from other parts of the world. Okay, so just as an example of what the reading of clothing does and can do and so on. Okay, all right. So I'm thinking about these terms, kin and dread and intimacy and value in this second decade of the 21st century. What sovereignty and kinship mean in this now second decade for the region's people. Thinking about, just to list very quickly, Puerto Ricans valiantly challenging the after effects of hurricanes, privatization, Wall Street hedge funds, and more. Barbados powerfully embracing Republican status, even as it continues to wrestle alongside all of us with what it means to court a global tourist market. Discomfort about the British imperial relationship that has manifested itself in a more coordinated and vigorous call from the Caribbean side for reparations for enslavement in the light of a clearer sense of the tremendous accumulation that resulted from the period and for the period of enslavement, but also after that time. And this is partly because of what has been brought to light by projects such as the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership, which I noticed that the Hutchins Center helps to fund at the University of London, a fantastic site if you haven't visited it. And historians are following the money as they trace the court claims of British citizens who sought part of the £20 million in compensation granted to slaveholders for the loss of their human property when slavery was abolished in 1833. When then Prime Minister David Cameron visited the region in 2015, advising Caribbean people to move on instead of continuing to harp on the moral and economic consequences of accumulation made possible by enslavement, we could kind of read this as a desire to kind of a kind of amnesia, if you will, and this was made even more visible in the Windrush scandal when it was discovered that children of Caribbean migrants to the UK in the post-World War II era, living continuously in the UK since the 1950s and 60s, were having trouble collecting their health and national insurance contributions, and in some cases were being deported to the Caribbean as part of the crackdown on immigration. This speaks to the tenuousness of their relationship to citizenship, even as their labor makes others comfortable in UK daily life, but it also represents an amnesia about the imperial dimension of the UK, which appears to want to understand itself as a discrete entity with empire in its past. Another way in which the colonial period persists into the dynamic present, I'm trying to think about, are those laws still on the books since the 19th century that criminalize same-sex desire and cross-dressing, partly as a way of continuing to criminalize particular bodies' entitlement to move freely. One section of the Summary Conviction Offences Ordinance in British Guyana in 1893 reads that it is illegal for anyone, quote, being a man in any public way or public place for any improper purpose to appear in female attire, or being a woman in any public way or public place for any improper purpose to appear in male attire. On February 6, 2009, 7 gender nonconforming persons were arrested in Georgetown, Guyana, with being wrongly attired in female clothing under this 1893 Act. After years of appeals by 4, Gulliver McEwen, Angel Clark, Peaches Fraser, and Isabella Prasad, on November 13, 2018, the Caribbean Court of Justice struck down the 1893 law as invalid. Here it would be important to note that attempts to remove such laws are often met with outrage about giving into the values of the immoral global north. In other words, they've been enfolded into our sense of what it means to be modern on our terms. And then I'm thinking in this project, another context about China as the region's latest superpower, and the question about its difference from the region's past and present. Its difference from past and present imperial powers and whether that matters. This is a context that interests me a lot. How have China and the Caribbean, or at least figures held to represent them, occupied space alongside each other, and with what consequences? In the region, they're, in a sense, transforming what it means to experience daily life with kind of massive highway projects that are literally making our sense of space and time, transforming our sense of space and time as we move from coast to coast. Such projects, which help cast Caribbean space as modern in particular recognizable ways, fuel speculation about China's role in the region and the complaints about Chinese workers competing, something is missing here. But it has to do with the fact that the fine print of these agreements didn't make it clear, or perhaps said something else about the extent to which Caribbean people would get jobs on these projects. And in fact, obviously for the Chinese state, these were opportunities to employ Chinese workers. Perhaps China's increasing prominence in the region as a source of major investment offers an opportunity to rethink older imperial and colonial relationships. If China's interest in the Caribbean is shaped by a need to develop new markets, find job opportunities for its citizens, exploit the Caribbean's proximity to the USA and the Panama Canal, compete with Taiwan, or secure crucial votes at the UN and other venues, what makes it so different from those older relationships, and why not make the best of it? And so when I think along these lines, I think of, I'm going to skip over to, it's about maybe 7. It's Achille Mbembe. I'll come back to these later if we have time. Yes, it's the next one. Thank you. So this is Mbembe talking about so obviously across the world, people are trying to work out what it means to be linked to China as a superpower. Across the African continent, this is happening. And here's Mbembe in May 2015 talking about the difference between, getting visas, students getting visas in, from Italy and France and so on, and getting resources from China. So I'm thinking about this project, the project I'm working on with some of the, when I'm thinking about sovereignty, these are some of the questions that I'm thinking about. In some ways then this project has China working itself through it in 2 different threads. In one thread where I'm thinking about sovereignty and the kind of geopolitical arrangements that the Caribbean finds itself embedded in the present, and then in the other thread where I'm thinking about China as one of the one of those places in which we're thinking about family ties in the Caribbean. And so when we're thinking about kin and lineage, then China is obviously part of that conversation. I'm skipping over a lot here. Okay. Finally, as a context for some of the things I'm thinking about, I am kind of interested in the kind of bleakness with which radical possibility is sometimes expressed when people kind of think about the independence moment, the kind of post-independent present. So in the English-speaking Caribbean, independence broadly means from the early 1960s to about the mid-1970s in general. And so with the Grenada Revolution, the shutting down of the revolution. For some in the region, there's a sense that radical change isn't even something to dream about anymore. It isn't even on the horizon anymore. Okay, and so that would be in line with the ways in which someone like Aliyah Abdurrahman, and I don't have these quotes up, but I can read them for you later on. She has in her essay, The Black Ecstatic, she has a lovely and bleak line about the ways in which the civil rights project had hoped for things such as a black president, a black person in the White House. And so what does it mean to know that we're post that moment, that moment, in fact, is behind us? So she talks about that as being simultaneously post-free and not yet free, requiring a modality that, quote, eschews the heroism of black past and the promise of liberated black futures in order to register and revere rapturous joy in the broken down present. And so she sees the present and in fact flashes of the present as a thing to be invested in, because in her reading, both past and future have, are no longer kind of sources of possibility. So let's see, the next slide, magically, I don't know how that happened, but that's actually the slide I need, which is the next one. Just to point to some of the fictional, I'm not going to remain with fiction today, but just to point to some of the texts that I'm looking at, which will, like one of them, I think Bois 2011, so that's already beyond the decade thing I've set for myself. I might have to scrap that. The other three are 2014. So Roxane Gay's on Untamed State, Walcott Hackshaw's Mrs. B, and James's Brief History of 7 Killings. And so I'm kind of, thinking about these questions of sovereignty. One of the things I'm thinking about is the representation of the Don, the drug trafficker, especially the iteration of the trafficker who is responsible for, in effect, is a parallel sovereign, responsible for a constituency. In the past, delivering votes for the ruling party, but then in the 80s, this figure morphs into, with the drug trade, with the Caribbean situated between South America and Europe and North America. So we see this elaborated here, and to some extent here, that figure becomes an important transnational negotiator and business person. And so I'm particularly interested in these texts in a kind of domestic quietude of this figure. In a sense, Moonlight also gives us that. What does it mean to have a kind of, what does it mean to have quiet time, and how is that negotiated, and so on? What does it mean that the neighborhood Don, in effect, shares governance of the urban landscape with what we might think of as the kind of traditional state stakeholders? Or those who, in Roxane Gay's novel, lacking the authority of the Don, are smaller gangs who, this is a story about kidnapping, but by minor gangs. And so what we see are elite, the elite who are being preyed upon, they're paying for their own security and bypassing, but also using up the resources of the state, and they're in battle with these gangs. And so what does it mean in some ways to bypass the state? So I'm interested in how these get represented, this figure of the trafficker in these texts. But I'm also interested, so as I read a novel like James's Brief History of 7 Killings, in the way in which I feel unmoored, because it would have seemed to me to be impossible to narrate the 70s and 80s without a certain kind of ideological surety. So in my mind, so the novel my experience of the 70s was that you were for this party or you were for this party. And it's not only that the novel doesn't make the villains and the heroes, doesn't map them out in the party lines that I would have imagined, but it doesn't care about that. And so for me, the fact that I was so disorienting told me how wedded I still am, even though I haven't lived in the region for decades, how wedded I still am to those ideological roadmaps. I feel unmoored without them, and I'm trying to understand the sensibility that does not need them and that hasn't for a long time now. I want to use the rest of this talk to think about blackness, or is it darkness? I hope you'll appreciate what I mean on the canvas. How can we discern here a conversation about value, about genealogy and kinship, about prosperity and dispossession? Here we're working with archives that are evidence of presence. So if you think about the photographs I showed earlier, I'm always trying to tell my students, oh my God, they're being surveilled. Look at how they're having to pause and face the camera. And my students say to me, but look, we know that they existed, right? It's present. So it's a different kind of, it also means that they're not undone. Even if they know that there's a certain kind of power valence, they're not undone by that. So here we're working with archives that are evidence of presence and at the same time of diminishment, of blackness used to prop up whiteness, for example. How are artists navigating this inheritance? And how are commentators inviting us into new entanglements with this visual archive? One of my favorite examples of this latter, that is the way in which critics are inviting us to re-see that traditional archive, is Omiseka Natasha Tinsley's discussion of this painting. The next slide, please. You might know this from the cover of her book, where she uses the Augusta Brunius painting from the kind of late 18th century, 1770 to 1780, of three Caribbean washerwomen by a river. This is oil on canvas. And Tinsley asks, even as we understand the fetishization of laboring bodies, the surveillance and sexualization of women in the context of a caste system, the tropes of woman as nature, and so on and so on and so on, she asks, can we also see women looking at each other? So she asks us to kind of, to claim that gaze and the fact, and to, yes, it is being taken, and yes, they're being exposed, but what might it mean to think about them looking at, desiring, working side by side with each other? So I have a quotation from her there. I stopped to look where texts take tropes like women as flowers, invented to justify controlling them, and to redeploy the same tropes to imagine a landscape belonging to Caribbean women and Caribbean women belonging to each other. So the Nigerian-American artist, I think I have an example of this. So it wouldn't be the next slide, but the two slides after that. Yes, thank you. The Nigerian-American artist Toyin Oji Odutola invents an archive to respond to a kind of visual lacuna in the archive. This is To Wander Determined, which was maybe 2017, 2018 at the Whitney. Life-size portraits rendered in charcoal, pastel, and pencil, described as being portraits on loan from two fictitious aristocratic Nigerian families. I'm interested in this desire to render prosperous blackness reclining and at ease. I'm very interested in the play of light and dark as part of this discussion of lineage and prosperity. Ximin Yang's discussion of British writer Afra Ben's 17th century text, Oronuko, or the Royal Slave, A True History, in which an African prince, Oronuko, and princess, Amoinda, are captured and sent to Suriname. Her discussion focuses on the ways in which the global circulation of an orientalizing hodgepodge sense of Asian commodities confers value. Yang wants us to appreciate how this happens in contexts that are read as only involving indigenous, African, and European systems. So she's looking at these texts and asking, how can we see the circulation of products associated in the reader's mind with Asia, with the East Indies, and so on. When Afro-Ben wants to transform the enslaved hero Orinoco into the princely romantic figure who can maintain royal status under the degrading conditions of enslavement, Yang reads this as a discourse of immortality, a means of attaining everlasting life that, quote, borrows from new developments in science and material culture, as well as from existing ideas about the antiquity of the imagined Orient. Yang presses us to think about how the East Indies makes its presence felt through cultural proxies, human, object, and animal, and to appreciate the Orient's function in commodifying New World slavery and mediating relations between colonizer and colonized. This presence is familiar to Ben's British readers in the 1688, in the 17th century, because of their own living rooms. That is to say, English domesticity is awash in chinoiserie, a term Yang defines as a poor imitation of products from Asia, craved by Europeans for their design, superior craftsmanship, and luxury. Yang refers to this as a European mismatch, a fantasy. Imoinda's skin is embellished with what the novella describes as fine flowers and birds, as if it were japanned. Yang contends that her, quote, japanned skin and Orinoco's polished jet blackness, and even their romance itself, is narrated as a discourse of the royal court with all its splendor and intrigue that would have been read in terms of an Oriental tale romance. Japan work emerges out of the desire for scarce and highly coveted artistically superior products from the East. A whole industry and technology grew up around learning to approximate the glossed and raised decorative designs of the lacquered furniture and ornaments imported from East Asia. Yang identifies Japan work as, quote, an activity of English ladies in the early 18th century, something made necessary by desire for these goods. So as Yang points out, Orinoco and Imoinda are doubly commodified as enslaved persons, and with skin, its darkness like varnish lacquer and ornamentation, its skin like Asiatic varnish. This is a varnish that coats, an Eastern patina promising a long shelf life, a protective coating that gives these African characters a distracting beauty and honor that, associated with the commodity producing Orient, familiarizes a potentially unfamiliar African difference and mystifies the labor to produce those commodities in the East and the horrific context of labor in the Middle Passage and in Suriname. So that's about darkness. In the other direction, in a sense, Krista Thompson discusses what she terms the visual economy of dancehall and hip-hop culture in terms of the play of light on surface. Thompson connects this to histories of surfacism in European art, the use of oil painting in 16th century Europe to highlight the gleam of instruments of technology and the luxurious apparel of merchants at a particular moment in the history of capital. Thompson discusses the experimentation with reproducing rays of light and also with casting objects with light in such a way that perfection as commodities was emphasized. Their optical value in the painting matched their value as commodities on the market, and in such a way that we as viewers would come to think of the object in the painting as having innate value. Thompson also connects this to the theorization of hypervisualization in the work of artists such as Kehinde Wiley. She says Wiley's portraits of diamonds and his monumentalized representations of black men caught in light similarly reflect on and are reflections of this unprecedented moment of emblazoned black visibility. So that slide is the next one after this blank one. So it's Shine, that one, yeah. So the next, so I think it's blank and then it's that one. Yes, that's a cover of the book. This is an article before the book came out, this is what I'm quoting from. Thompson also discusses the work of the videographer, both in the space of the dance hall in Jamaica and on prom night in the Bahamas. The importance of stepping up, of being equal to the moment that the video light shines on you is what gets her attention. And here it is interesting to me that rather than seek out photographs as mementos of prom night to treasure and to save, the point is this moment of celebrity for the prom goers, the moment of being seen to arrive on the red carpet, the flash of light. Thompson and others have also commented on the disapproval of Jamaican elites for working class Jamaicans who lighten their skin. When Vibes Cartel, a Jamaican dancehall artist, says that his bleached skin enhances his tattoos, he can certainly be heard as colluding with or succumbing to the worship of light skin, the charge with which black working class practices of bleaching are usually met. But he's surely declaring other things as well, that light skin as a stated value is not only inherited, that its capacity to be acquired is as natural or unnatural as strategic sexual relations with light-skinned partners for reproductive purposes, that we can see light skin as a shifting rather than inherent or natural characteristic, and that he has the resources to make this transformation if he wishes, and therefore to be strategic about his own capacity to profit from this socially valued characteristic, and that he has the capacity to describe his choice as aesthetic rather than political or moral, as in, this is good for my tattoos. Skin adornment here becomes another way to step into the light, to shift notions of inheritance that are held to be a given or out of our control. It is another nodal point in a long-standing conversation about lineage, refinement, accumulation, and value. So I want to focus on two paintings. Wait, so we could do the next one too, just to show you the next slide, please, I think. Just to show you Ebony Patterson, who is one of the artists, one of the Jamaican artists who in this series from at this point, this is like maybe 10, 12 years old, this series. But in the series, one of the things that Patterson is doing is in a sense documenting bling, but also in a way alluding to the enhancement of the skin, if you like, to bleach skin. Okay, I want to focus on two paintings which really come together for me because of what seems to be their similar investment in the other direction. So the next slide, please. Because of what seems to be their similar investment in blackness. Is it blackness or darkness? Is it darkness on canvas and the representation of skin color? So this is Philip Thomas, Marshall, Jamaica 2021. And this is Kelly Sinaper Mary, Guadeloupe, part of her, she has a years-long Notebook of No Return series, which has many iterations. But this is a detail from one of the paintings from that series. I'm aware that there is probably some obvious trend, technique, tendency here among artists and their practice, of which, I'm just not aware. But in these images by the Guadeloupean artist Kelly Sinaper Mary and the Jamaican artist Philip Thomas, I'm riveted by deep, deep blackness in the representation of the skin, among other things, and by what this could suggest about the value of blackness, darkness in these paintings that seem to foreground themes of wealth, aspiration, decorum. The Thomas painting gestures toward a certain visual lineage, and that is because, let me skip to, if you could give me please, I have a close-up. I'll show you later, but it's a close-up of this. And it's basically a stereotypical, in this country, it would be a black person with watermelon or something like that. It's a photo, I think it's a kind of exaggeration of white teeth or something like that. So it's a kind of, Alan Sekulow would refer to this, I guess, in terms of the shadow archive. Except that it's not in the shadows. It's right there on the wall. And for secular heroes, leaders, moral exemplars, celebrities conceal and should also always imply the trace of the shadow archive, the poor, the diseased, the insane, the criminal, the non-white, the female, and all other embodiments of the worthy, because it's partly what makes you know that this is the hero, and so on. So it is, of course, easy to read in these images, to read for affectation and excess, which is how non-white constituencies have been read in relation to the idea that they weren't clothed enough or that they tried to rise above their station in imitating Europeans. And we can imagine a critique that reprimands a desire to accumulate or adorn like the former colonial masters or in the style of missionaries. In at least one of the images, and I'll come to that later, we can see that Sinipa Mary is referencing a Bible, and she's talked about the ways in which her parents, who were Jehovah's Witnesses, severed their ties to the Hindu religion of her grandparents. For both artists, the canvases are busy, dots and stripes and fringes and reflections and shadows, at least in the Thomas one, that are almost dizzying. What reads to me as rigidity in the male figure in Thomas's piece could suggest a posture of dis-ease with the surroundings or not. In Sinipa Mary's paintings, the human figure shares life with fauna and tiles and patterned walls that seem to seethe with life. These writhing plants are in conversation with and are probably figures from folklore and fantasy on her body. So when we do a close-up of her body, you will see that her body is also embellished. And of course, this ornamental body brings me back to Ximing Yang's discussion of Japanning as a way of adding value to furniture, and of Afroben's narrative citation of the technique to add value to the enslaved royal body. The leaves suggest, and my sister has identified them as elephant ears or the Alocasia family. Thank you, Grace Smith. These leaves suggest histories of transplanting species to the Caribbean from elsewhere, part of the control of space and other resources, as colonial authorities experimented with what would be profitable or convenient for consumers elsewhere. This introduction of plant life to adorn and instrumentalize reminds us of the meanings of cultivation, to cultivate, to prepare and use land for growing crops, to improve and render fertile by husbandry, to cultivate, to grow and improve a plant, crop, etc. for commercial purposes, to cultivate, to refine or improve a person, the mind, the abilities by education or training. We can see this third meaning in the way that these bodies have arranged themselves in poses that are often identified with histories of respectability. But when do these poses also get read as owned rather than forced, borrowed, or leased? And how have laborers and their descendants made cultivation, food, health, solace work for them instead of just for others? I just wanted to see if we can get some close-up. So the next one, please. So this is basically it was a triptych, and what I'm showing you are two of the paintings from that. So this one gestures in her notes about the paintings to her father, and the Bible is on the couch here. And again, you see the plant life, the very the plants are alive, but I think, but in some ways, so too is the wood and so on. Everything is writhing. And then the next, please. I think I tried to do a close-up. I wanted to get more of this. I think here you can see more of what's going on. And then I think the next one has I was trying to get that again. And then the next one, please. I was trying to, you can't really see it, but her fingers, her hands, there's a figure here. And so I'm reading that, and they're in conversation, of course, with the clothing, which already has floral patterns. And so I think that there's a conversation going on between the the body and the clothing, the body and the what's in the living room, but also I guess I could, you know, try to identify specifically these figures from folklore or children's tales and so on. These two images, also by Sinapa Mary, the next ones. Okay. Also utilize intense blackness. One is from the cover of Andil Gosain's book, Nature's Wild. The other is from a recent issue of the UK journal Wasafiri. And this image is part of a recent exhibition, Fragments of Epic Memory, curated by Julie Crooks for the Art Gallery of Ontario. In his piece for that catalogue, Gosain quotes Sinapa Mary as saying, "I wanted the characters in this series to be ghostly and monstrous, straight out of the depths of black waters." And black water has its own, the Kalapani, it's the sense of crossing a treacherous ocean from the Indian subcontinent to the Americas, and you know, being thrown into crisis, losing caste, and so on. So the depths of black waters, while barring their thorns from the white sea urchins. So she references being monstrous. I wanted the characters to be ghostly and monstrous. I also wanted them to be healers, but with a very human and gentle gaze at the same time. Monstrous and gentle simultaneously. I'm intrigued by this embracing of multiple and, to me, paradoxical elements as I continue to think through these questions. Thank you.
Great, fabulous, thank you. Thank you. I take it that No Book of No Return is a riff on Aimé Césaire, right?
That's right. So in some of the things, I do have a quotation from Césaire, but that's interesting. It seems to me it's not coincidental for me that the Guadeloupean is going to have Césaire at the forefront. And so we could think about the ways in which a notebook, maybe I can find it here.
You might explain to them what Césaire, the book.
Yes. I'm doing it.
And that's The Invisible Man by Kerry James Marshall on the wall.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't recognize that.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
Kerry James Marshall.
Oh, I see. No, I didn't know that.
Invisible
So
Man.
it's citing.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
See?
That's why you come here.
Exactly. What do I want? I want the Césaire quotation because the cahier is a it's basically between 1939 and 1945. Césaire, one of the intellectuals associated with negritude, publishes Notebook of a Return to My Native Land. In this passage, for example, he talks about the land basically reducing the laborer to shit so that tender cane and silky cotton can come out of it. So the whole text, especially the beginning of the text, it changes as you kind of go in, but it's about the persona returning to the Caribbean, a place like Martinique, smallpox pitted. The landscape is described in very negative terms, and one of the themes running through it is what Rodney would call the underdevelopment of the Caribbean for the sake of French prosperity. So the text is kind of thinking through that. So the return to the native land in that case, if we're to take Césaire literally, is Césaire returning from study in France to the Martinican landscape, to kind of look out at the way it has been ravished for imperialism. And so it would be, and so I guess to kind of tease this out, for Kelly Sanapa Mary, what is it? Not a return. It's trying to remember the phrase, notebook of no return, then suggests that one must come to terms with what one has. We could reference the ways in which, so in some ways that's an echo of the Creolists, the theorists, some of whom I was gesturing towards when I talked about these discourses about who gets constituted as an insider, a Creole person, as opposed to someone who is outside of the plantation matrix. And so famously, Martinican thinkers, the Creolists, Bernabe, Chamoiseau, and the third one I'm forgetting, talked about the need to stop looking to Europe, Africa, and Asia as Caribbean people for our identity, but instead not only to think through Caribbeanness, but to see that Caribbeanness was closer to places like Hawaii, because Hawaii and other like places have had a similar plantation history. So it's a call to look in that way instead of lineage. So one way to think about what Senator Mary is saying is that it is echoing a kind of post-Césaire generation, and it is echoing the Creolists and saying, stop thinking through return. There are ways also to complicate that in that, as I said, when she talks about her family, she talks about not realizing she was of South Asian descent. You know, she knew that she was dark-skinned in a country in which she hadn't heard much about the history of indentureship in public, but neither in her home, because her parents were actively kind of privileging another kind of lineage. So there are all kinds of ways to kind of think through no return, notebook of no return. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Questions, comments?
Faith Lois Smith.
Yes.
Thank you
Kimberly
so much
Benita
for
Brown.
this is giving me so much to work with, so apologies for the questions. One, what's the relationship between your project and Hartman's critical fabulation? And as an extension of that, you have a set of materials that, like, you have photographs that have no attribution, or you have material objects that have no provenance that you can track. How are you going to rein in all of that within this space, and how do you want to talk about that?
Thank you.
Right? And then I have a question about, like, you know, as you were presenting, and until the close-up, I didn't see that it was Kerry James Marshall, but the images look like Marshall images, and I guess that's why the Marshall is in the...
So it's a clear citation.
It's a citation,
Citation
yes.
To be generous, or citation?
I think it's a citation to be generous.
All right.
And then, so then I wondered about, like, right now they're doing a loophole retreat in Venice, where we are not currently. But Simone Lee being, you know, one generation removed from Jamaica, but also having sculpture that looks a lot like what you are discussing here, and how you want to talk about maybe the dispersal of the Caribbean, and then where that goes. And then lastly, music. What are you going to do about music?
Right.
That's all.
Okay, thank you very much. So for the can't read my writing. For the second thing, which is photographs and material, I think that's material objects. So for the most part, I'm using paintings or drawings. I hesitate to use the word paintings for somebody like, oh my gosh, can't remember which, there was, anyway. So for the most part, I'm using paintings, and so the question of attribute, I'm dealing with artists who are working now, and so that question of attribution will come up for me in the extent to which to my mind, I'm very embedded in, to talk about lineage, I'm very embedded or even overly embedded in a certain kind of historical context. So to me, I'm still overburdening these discussions with that. And so I'm trying to, my task for myself is to move away from that. And so what that read like today was a list of some of the things happening in the moment that are on my mind. But that's my problem, that I'm very comfortable in the 19th century and the 20th century. And so the question of if you were asking about photographs that I couldn't identify, for example, those tend to be in the archive. That is to say, the early 20th century postcard. I need to find it, but what I'm saying is that in the work I'm doing, most of the artists I'll be working with are working right now. This thing about critical fabulation, thank you. So the critic Sadia Hartman talks about the way that when we go to the archives, we are trying to find something there. We're working with what we find, but at the same time, we're having to, just because of the absence, just because of the diminishment of the lives that we're seeking, what we do a lot is we make up stories. And so for her, what is important is to understand that that is what we do in the archive, but also to reflect on that fabulation. So it's not just that we are working with we're working with a whole, as it were, and we're weaving something around it, but we have to also reflect on the fact that we have to do it. And so in a way, yes, that's what one is necessarily doing. I think what you're asking me to do is to be upfront and to be critical about the fact that I'm doing that, and to be critical about the moments when I'm doing that. Yeah.
You already did that when you were talking about just the conferences. Just when you were talking about the two women, like the melting of the coins in order to make the bracelets. That's already a present and understood way of like narrativizing what possibly took place. So you're already doing that. So,
all right.
So
Okay.
Okay, I'll take that.
Yes, I will. There was something else. I mean, thanks for the Kerry James, and then you're saying the Simone Lee as well, for sure. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. So then, what does the figure on the wall mean in the Kerry James painting? I mean,
Well, it's Invisible Man. I mean, that's what the title of the portrait is.
okay,
Right, Invisible Man.
okay.
Oh.
I still want
The title of the portrait is
Thank you.
Invisible Man.
All right.
Now,
Thank you. All right.
Respectability as an against invisibility, right? So kind of what are they kind of, what if that is sort of the bogeyman,
Yeah.
what does that kind of comportment and portraiture kind of do in the face of that?
Right. Exactly. And how is Thomas's different from Sanapa Mary's? Exactly. Thank you. Right.
Thank you, colleague.
Didn't speak into the mic.
The name is Siseko Kumalo, a visiting fellow in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences on the Harvard South African Fellowship Program. I've got two questions for you. And I think the second question is a bit of an easier question. I'd like to push back on your use of the concept of bodies, just because I think that the concept deontologizes the people that you're theorizing and thinking about and thinking with, right? And I'm curious about how that process of deontolization falls within, I suppose, both the economic factors that you're thinking about, the dispossession that you're thinking about, the dismemberments that you're thinking about, and to then use a concept such as, and I think in the course of the paper, as you were presenting the paper, you used it at least 2, if not 3 times. Yeah.
Okay.
And I want to push back on that to say, let's think a bit more critically about what the project attempts to do. Maybe indeed you're not necessarily trying to speak back to the deontolization, but if that's the case, then I go back to my first question around the naming, right? Now, back at home, Lebo Mashila, the poet, has a very, very beautiful poem, actually, that she recited last year, where she says, in Africa, names are asked for. Blood is spilt in the name of naming on the African continent. And I'm curious about, in thinking about naming and in thinking about the question of ontology as it refers to blackness, black bodies, and indigeneity, how do we think about precisely the dismemberment, right? Because naming happens within a community, right? And I like the fact that you're thinking about naming within the questions of kinship or kinlessness, right? Thinking about the process then of naming against particular institutions and ritualized processes of naming, right? What happens when those are taken away? What happens in the context of being dispossessed of all of that and still attempting to remember, right? To restitch processes of naming and the search, I would suppose, of an ontological legitimacy, right? Which is why I go to the second question of the use of the concept of bodies.
That's right. Thanks very much for that, because among other things, what you're making me realize is that in the attempt to catalog something, then then I erased a whole tradition of responding exactly to that. You couldn't, so one of the things that happens very early on, it doesn't happen in Cuba. I mean, the character of colonialism is different from territory to territory. But in some territories, what happens is that you cannot utter names that sound African, right? And so you can't give your child an African name. And so what that means, very quick, but then we find FIBA in the archive, right? So Friday, what you're telling me is that in cataloging the loss and the violence, if one doesn't immediately also say, but here are these other things that happened as well, then all you're hearing is one side, and in fact then one is intensifying the violence in that sense. So I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for this presentation. This is really fantastic, and how you move across genre, sort of literature, visuality. I was interested, well, 2 things. One, just on the question of bodies, just if you're engaging African feminist work on the body and the epistemology, ontology of the body, because of course they're not blank bodies that are moving across the Atlantic, and what that can tell us about what process was happening. And the second thing was just coming off the question that Kimberly posed about music, and thinking about dancehall. Like last year, I think, or during the pandemic, I watched Dancehall Queen, and if you, Bibi Bakari Yusuf has a really great thesis on dancehall culture and bodies, and thinking about just what dancehall culture means, particularly in relation to the Middle Passage and the processes of remembering through the body and that kind of thing. And more importantly, thinking transnationally, how dancehall circulates in a way that is different than hip-hop, for example, as a different figuration of blackness outside of hegemonic blackness that is figured or over-determined by North American, or particularly African-American blackness, and what dancehall gives us a window into globally. So, for example, outside of South Africa, the most popular dance, well, at least one of the most popular music forms is dancehall, right? Over and above hip-hop, for example. What does dancehall do as a global form of blackness that, let's say, hip-hop doesn't necessarily do or can't speak to, particularly for these post-revolution, post-independence, post-colonial societies, and, you know, the kind of move from reggae to dancehall, what that is speaking to that perhaps hip hop doesn't quite do.
Right. Thanks very much. That's another lineage to explore. And it's a second, so what you're saying is that I use bodies indiscriminately and
I didn't say that.
No, but I'm saying it now. And yet I would have told you that I didn't use bodies. And so it's interesting that it's a call for me to be self-conscious about what I'm saying. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
I wouldn't say you in particular. That was what Siseko said, and I'm not going to take on that one. But I would say that there is a tendency by North American feminists to take the body as a blank script, as if there's not an ontology, an epistemology of the body that is ruptured by transatlantic slavery, and that is also transformed. So it becomes a door of no return, and there was nothing, but also that the body was blank before.
Right. Thank you.
That's not you specifically.
No, I understand. But using body in a particular way quickly then defaults to it. And I think that's what I'm hearing. So I appreciate that.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. My question, I think, goes back to what you were talking about with like transience and like who's thought to supposed to be in the Caribbean, where maybe like South Asians are and you said like Lebanese might be seen as more transient, and blackness is supposed to like have been there. My question, I guess, might be around like the idea of like culture. And so there's an anthropologist named Varanjani Munasinghe who does research with South Asians in Trinidad. And one of her arguments is that like South Asians are seen as, or Indians are seen as like culturally pure in a way, like being like tied to India or South Asia, and Black Caribbeans are seen as like culturally like having no culture, and thus they can be seen to metonymize the nation. Of course, that's not an empirical reality. Of course, Black people have culture, and so not saying they don't have culture. But my question then is kind of related to that, and how she puts like East Indians in relationship to Black people. I was wondering if you see that at work in any of the images that you have, and because it also seems like there's a kind of malleability to Blackness. I didn't see more pictures of Indians in your presentation, or South Asians, but I was thinking about some of the pictures. There seems to be like this malleability to Blackness in some of the images, like the one with the Kerry James Marshall, and there's also, it seems also to be this like fixity that you're also trying to unmoor. So I was just wondering if that, if you see that working.
On the malleability with the Philip Thomas image, tell me what you mean.
Oh, I just meant like, it just seems like Blackness kind of can shift and change in many of those images, and the image with the Sinipa Mary, I think that's her. It also reminded me of like a Ralph Lauren ad in a way, or I just saw this like, and I was then thinking about.
So you thought of advertising.
In a way, and I was thinking about. I was trying to look up the woman who wrote the book about. There's a book about like Black visual culture, and she looks at these ads. But what I was just thinking about is just there seems to be like this malleability to Blackness, and that Black figures can stand in different scenes and categories, and might still be able to metonymize the nation, where there might still be this fixity to South Asian images as well. And I was just wondering if you see that working as well, or no.
Thank you very much for that, because what struck me about these images is that across what would be seen as differently racialized lines, two artists are using I don't know what the word is, a texture. It might not be they might not be the same as each other, but they're registering as this deep, concentrated texture in an age where, if in music videos, to me, everybody's going the other way. That the last thing you want to do is get intense Blackness, to my mind, in the music that I'm when I'm visualizing music, and so I was riveted by that. And one of the things that Sinipa Mary is thinking about, in fact, is the idea within Indo-Guadeloupean circles that there is a kind of purer, better, finer, less crass way of being in the Caribbean than when you're with black people. So to answer the question about purity and so on, certainly that's you hear that you see that in the colonial documents, and you hear that today, and it in the paper, the way I gestured to it was through the idea of a superior civilization. It's also important to me that we see that registers as a compliment, but really the way that you cash that in is that you're, as far as I can see, you're given more work to do. You're a better worker. So it doesn't redound to some kind of, I mean, there's a case to be made that you're less criminalizable, for sure. That's always going to be made compared to people who get identified as African descended, who are always going to be at the top of that list of being criminalizable. But it really, those groups are all at the bottom of the pile. And so what it gets to be seen as the purer race, it seems to me at some level, is from what I can see is not much in the kind of larger national scene. I want to think a lot. I want to think through this thing about malleability, and especially the reference to advertising, which now that you say it, of course, I'm going to see that everywhere. I didn't see that here. So somehow I had extracted it out of that conversation, and I would like to know, put it there because you've told me about it. So I appreciate that. Yeah. What?
Ralph Lauren's HBCU ad, was it Howard or Control related? They had the whole design.
Oh my God, I didn't know Ralph Lauren had HBCU ads. I watch Netflix and that's it. No advertising. I need to do something about that.
Yeah. Watch PBS.
Hi, Faith.
Faith, I have another meeting I have to go. This
Okay.
is fabulous.
Thank you.
Okay. See you all.
Hi, Faith. Just commending you on a very ambitious and wide-ranging project. Is that why you've got your decade limit for the books?
Yeah, we're trying to keep moving.
If it helps, Kerry Young wrote a follow-up to POW called Gloria.
Yes.
But I don't know.
Follow-up. So
Yeah.
that one is, so
And that would have fallen within your
2015. 2018 is something about the mountains. So it's a trilogy, and they're all looking at the same events from different perspectives.
Yes.
So I can use the third one, yeah. Which means I have to read the third one, but yes. But
Okay.
thank you, yeah.
What I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to say it's interesting that you are kind of coming to this awareness of body, but with your title, DreadKin, you're already with the body right at the beginning, because dread is external, it's the body. Mm-hmm. And also, given that the black body is, in the New World, it's a sign of resistance, right? Mm-hmm. So it's part of the tradition of resistance is just being black in the New World and alive, right? Wow. So I think it's something that, should be considered. I'm just wondering if the project itself, because it seems to me like it's a kind of reclamation or an act of resistance, what you're defining in these people redefining themselves. Is it going within a tradition, or are you seeing something completely new? Is it following Aimé Césaire, even Kamau Brathwaite, the kinds of ways in which they're defining what the Caribbean is and will be, and if it stands alone? And speaking about standing alone, I think also one of the things, if you do go to music, or if you are looking at things when you're looking at the African American and the Caribbean, I think we often make the mistake of thinking that they stand alone. But there's always been communication across, and movements across. Ska is influenced by R&B, all of that, and so dancehall doesn't stand apart from hip hop. All of these things kind of have bridges, and so if you're going to go there, it's going to be complex. I'm just saying, because even with the art that I'm looking at, the movements are so similar from the Caribbean across Africa, and when we talk about the Caribbean, we talk about the French Caribbean, the Dutch Caribbean, the English Caribbean, and they're all having similar movements, which tells us that somehow there's some kind of undercurrent, which is beyond just the location that they're in. I mean, which is where I'm finding I'm going to have to read what you're doing, even as you produce it, because I'm thinking that it relates to a lot of the work I'm thinking about, where I'm looking at philosophy and how it adapts to places in the New World. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Just to answer quickly, one of the things I'm trying not to do, so you asked about Brathwaite, for example. I'm trying not to read. I'm trying to read a generation of work which I can't understand because I'm not using certain kinds of keys, certain kinds of signposts, and I'm trying to read them without those signposts. I may end up weaving in and out, but at the moment it seems like the problem with my readings is that I'm imposing these inherited signposts, and I'm trying to read and to ask what is going on instead of to assume what. Yeah. But thank you.
One last question.
I just wanted to know your opinion on.
I just wanted to know your opinion on dreadlocks versus locks and why.
Yeah. And remember salon dreads. There's a whole range. Okay. I guess for me, that conversation has to be attached to people and generations, because some people will always be will always be seen as out of place and criminalizable. Always, always, always. Whatever word we're gonna use, some people will always get credit for wearing locks because of the bodies and the status that they have. So using one term or the other for me isn't going to be the determining factor. I want to see what they're embedded in as we're using one word or the other. If that makes sense.
That's powerful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody. Oh, thank you so much. Thanks. Thank you. I appreciate everything. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
You're unconnected.
And then this is
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much.